Good morning, and welcome to the provisional briefing for the November 5th, 2024 presidential election. Thank you to all of you who have joined us this morning to go over important updates and reminders as it relates to the provisional process for this coming election. We really appreciate all of you for joining us, and we hope the information we provide today will be informative and helpful as you prepare for this election. Do keep in mind that this briefing is intended for provisional specialists, the individuals helping with the provisional process and helping voters complete their envelope and log the materials. If you're a chief, assistant chief, or another officer, we're going to cover information about your part of the process at a later time. I'm very pleased to be joined by a number of our office staff for this briefing, including our Deputy Director of Elections and Deputy General Registrar, Cheryl Jones, our Voter Services and Same-Day Registration Manager, Bushra Ardalan. My name is Ravi Udeshi, and I serve as our Election Manager. We have Gretchen Coleman, our Election Officer Manager, Sean Rogers, our Training and Operations Manager, Jean Tenson, Training and Operations Specialist, and Susan Burnell and Steve Wake, members of our Training and Operations staff. Between all of us, we hope we present the information that you'll find helpful and answer your questions today. And speaking of questions, be aware that you can use the question and answer function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to ask any questions you may have, and we'll answer those live at the end of the briefing. Our agenda today includes first, I'm going to go over the overview and updates for the provisional process. Sean will take you through the actual steps of the provisional process that you'll be following in your precinct on election day. We're going to do some practice situations, so be ready to answer some Zoom polls. Gretchen will take you through reminders and best practices, and then all of us will take some time to answer your questions. All right, let's start with an interactive poll just to get the juices flowing here. So first, have you ever helped a voter with a provisional ballot before? So if you've ever been a chief or an assistant chief or an SDR specialist in the past, then perhaps you've done so. We also know that there's a lot more provisional specialists in this election. So there's many of you who may have never helped with this process before, and we just want to get a sense of who's with us here today. Gretchen, I see the answers flowing in fast and furious. Now remember, if you're answering a Zoom poll, that shows up in a special screen, a special window on your screen, so just make sure you answer it there. All right, we have more than 250 responses in, and we can see that about 60% of you have helped with a voter with a provisional ballot before, and about 40% of you have not. Whether you have or you haven't, that's completely okay. The purpose of today's briefing is to get you ready for the provisional process on election day, in addition to the provisional training you've already completed before now. All right, let's jump into the next part of our process here, which is looking over the overview and updates. So first, what is a provisional ballot? If you're not sure, a provisional ballot occurs when the situation is unclear if a voter is eligible to vote routinely and cast a ballot on the DS200. So essentially, that voter is not yet permitted to vote their ballot on the scanner, but they do get to mark a ballot, put it in a provisional envelope, and set it aside to be adjudicated and determined later. That adjudication occurs by our electoral board. The Fairfax County Electoral Board will follow Virginia law and determine if the ballot should be counted. And if so, it will be included with the official results of the election. Now, what's same-day registration? Same-day registration is a type of provisional voting where the voter registers to vote and votes a provisional ballot at the same time. The reason we do that is because, again, A, that's Virginia law, and B, at the time the voter fills out the voter registration application on one side of the envelope, we're not sure if that voter is eligible to be will be properly registered or not. We need to make sure that they've completed the registration form completely and accurately and that they are eligible to register. Once office staff determine that shortly after election day, the electoral board will then review the voter's registration status and make a determination on their provisional ballot. So what are some types of situations that lead to provisional ballots? Well, for an SDR situation, a same-day registration situation, it's if a voter perhaps has not registered but does live in your precinct. Because again, remember, Virginia law requires a voter to vote in the precinct in which they live or are registered. The other common situation leading to a same-day registration is if the voter has moved into your precinct. So again, that's maybe the voter is not a registered voter at all, or the voter's registered, but they've recently moved and now need to update their registration. So those are two situations that would lead to a same-day registration provisional ballot. What about non-SDR provisional ballots? So these are situations where the voter is already on your poll pad for the most part, but there's some other situation occurring. The most common one is perhaps the voter was sent an absentee ballot, but did not bring it with them to the polling place. In that case, they are eligible to vote a provisional ballot. Or these are much more rare, but perhaps a voter is shown in the poll pad as having already voted. Perhaps they voted during the early voting period and didn't remember that, or perhaps an election officer made a mistake and checked in the wrong voter earlier in the day. Or if a voter does not have an acceptable ID and declines to complete an ID confirmation statement. Remember, if a voter doesn't have their ID, they have the option, per Virginia law, of completing a form known as the ID confirmation statement that suffices as an acceptable ID, and then they would be eligible to vote routinely. So that's a really rare situation when someone doesn't have their ID and doesn't want to complete that form, but that would also lead to a non-SDR provisional ballot. Now let's talk about all of you as provisional specialists. So your responsibilities include helping voters complete their provisional ballot for all types of provisional situations, whether same-day registration or any other situation. So you help the voter complete their envelope. And then you're going to enter the data from that envelope into the provisional ballot log on the admin tablet. Essentially, we need to make a list of all the voters who have voted provisionally, and you're inputting that into the admin tablet to help us do that. Now, the position title of provisional specialist is new. That position used to be referred to as an SDR specialist, but there is no change in the responsibilities of the position. It's still the same position. You're still helping voters with all of the administrative parts of the provisional process. And for this election only, it's a large, complex presidential election with high voter turnout. We are assigning 2 provisional specialists to every precinct. So in each precinct, 1 provisional specialist might be experienced, 1 might be new to the process, but we're confident the 2 of you working together will be able to help every voter who needs to complete a provisional ballot. You might be wondering how many provisional ballots might you see and what's the breakdown for the reasons. So here's a chart showing you the provisional reasons from the election 1 year ago in November 2023. And as you can see, it's about a little more than half and half, but most voters who are doing a provisional ballot are either doing a same-day registration, or it's someone who requests an absentee ballot but didn't bring it with them to the polling place to surrender. Those are by far the 2 most common situations. There are a few other small situations. As you can see, there were a handful of situations where a voter was shown in the poll book as having already voted, a handful where the voter did not have an acceptable ID and declined to complete an ID confirmation statement. And then there were a number of other situations. In this election, we don't believe there should be many, if any, other situations. They should really fall into one of the other categories, and we're going to encourage you to call the office if that occurs. Overall, in the election a year ago, you can see we had a little over 4,000 provisional ballots. How many do we think we're going to get in this election? Well, it's a presidential election, and a lot more people vote, and people who may not have voted routinely over the past few years. So we are preparing for anywhere between 10 to 25,000 total provisional ballots this election. That means in an average precinct, you may get anywhere from 50 to 100 provisional ballots. And that's why we're assigning 2 provisional specialists to each precinct to help with that workload. All right, so what does your voting room layout look like, and where are you as the provisional specialist going to be positioned? Well, as always, the voting room layout is set up in a bit of a circular fashion, with a voter moving from the entrance to the check-in table, to the ballot table, to the voting booths, to scanning the ballot, to the exit. But you as the provisional specialist have a special place in this layout. You're going to be right next to the chief. So the chief's table will be in one area of the room, and the provisional table should be right next to it. Anytime you are helping a provisional voter, they should be seated at the provisional table with you. And it's going to be your responsibility to make sure that voter does not take that ballot and walk over to the scanner to scan it. So ideally, you want to work with the chief to position the provisional table and chief's table far away from the scanner. What is the division of responsibilities between the chief and assistant chief and you as the provisional specialist? Well, it is a little bit different this time. So, and if you haven't served in the June election, it might be significantly different than what you're used to in the past. So for this election, first, the chief or assistant chief determines the voter's eligibility to do a same-day registration or provisional ballot. And to do that, they may need to look up the voter in the My Neighborhood app on the admin tablet to determine where the voter used to live and the precinct congressional district for that. So again, first, the chief or assistant chief will complete that part of the process, determining whether the voter can, if and can, do a provisional ballot. Then the process turns to you. As the provisional specialist, your job is to help guide the voter in completing the provisional envelope. You want to make sure the voter fills out all fields completely and accurately on the provisional envelope. Because if any fields are missing, that may mean the voter's provisional ballot cannot be considered. So you have a very important responsibility. Once the voter has completed the provisional envelope, your other main duty is to make sure to add that entry to the provisional log on the admin tablet. So again, the chief or assistant chief determines the voter's eligibility, and then you as the provisional specialist help the actual voter through the process of completing the provisional envelope and then log it. To help everyone with that process in this election, we're issuing 2 admin tablets to each precinct. So one admin tablet will be shared by the chief and assistant chief, and one admin tablet will be shared by the provisional specialist, so that each of you can use your admin tablet for the functions assigned to you. The Virginia Department of Elections has updated the provisional envelope for this election, and we want to make sure you're aware of that. Primarily, the front of the envelope, the same-day registration side, now has an additional protected voter reason. That doesn't really impact you or your process. It's just something we want you to be aware of, and that's what led to a change in this envelope. In addition, there are some other formatting changes to the envelope that we're using here in Fairfax County. On the back side of the envelope, you'll see that the flap is now on the right side of the envelope. The barcode and other information is still at the top of the envelope, and that is for office use only. So looking at the right side of your screen right now, the back side of the envelope, that top part where you see the yes, no check boxes and the barcode, please don't mark anything in that area. Now keep in mind, this envelope is 2-sided for a reason. On the front side of the envelope, the SDR side, which you know because it has the letters SDR in large letters, and at the top left, it says same-day registration provisional ballot. That side of the envelope is completed by voters who need to do a same-day registration. The other side of the envelope, the back side, you can see there towards the top, it says provisional ballot, all other provisional reasons. So that's for any other provisional situation that's not a same-day registration. And a voter should only complete one side or the other of the provisional envelope. If the voter makes a mistake and starts completing the wrong side, or you ask them to complete the wrong side, no worries. You can spoil the envelope and give them a new one. As always, we are providing provisional materials in 4 languages. That includes the envelopes themselves, as well as things like the provisional voter notice and other materials in the voting room. We do want to make sure you're aware of one distinction that might catch you on election day, which is that the English language provisional envelope is a slightly different size, slightly smaller than the envelopes in the other languages. That's completely okay. Don't worry about it. That's just a quirk due to different printing reasons. So the English envelope is a slightly different size than the ones in the other languages. And just remember that if a voter fills out a request for assistance form or otherwise requests materials in in Spanish, Vietnamese, or Korean, you may offer them the provisional materials in that language as well. And every precinct will receive some supplies in Spanish, Vietnamese, and Korean, in addition to a large supply in English. We're also excited to again offer our special provisional overlays in this election. So what does a provisional overlay look like, and what is its purpose? Well, first, when you look at the information on these envelopes, it's hard to review it to make sure that every single required piece of information has been filled in. And we want to make that a little bit easier for you. So what we've done is we've created overlays, plastic overlays that you can put on top of the envelope that focus your eyes on the most important areas that you need to check. What do those look like? There you go. That's what the overlays look like. When you put an overlay on top of the envelope, Now it's much easier to see just the required fields and whether or not a voter and you have filled them all in, because a couple of these things are things that you fill in as the election officer as well. Also, be aware that in this election, we have now created overlays for both sides of the envelope. So in the last election, we had overlays for the SDR side. We are now issuing overlays for the non-SDR side as well. So you'll have two different overlays, and we're going to give you two sets of each overlay. So you'll have 4 overlays total. So each provisional specialist can have one set of the overlays to use. And again, it's going to be a required part of the process to use these overlays to double check to make sure all fields are filled in correctly. We got great feedback earlier this year when we did them as a pilot process in March and then rolled them out to every precinct in June. And we noticed a significant reduction in errors in the precincts that use the overlays. So do make sure to use the overlays to help you catch any errors. Now let's look at the voter referral worksheet. So the voter referral worksheet is slightly updated again for this election, and it received significant updates in the June election earlier this year. The voter referral worksheet is a form that is used to help assess a voter's non-routine situation, especially if that situation leads to a provisional ballot. There are 2 sides to the voter referral worksheet, and it's 8.5 by 14 inches this election. The front of the form is primarily used by the chief or assistant chief. So it's no longer the check-in officer that starts this form, it's the chief or assistant chief that starts this form. So let's say a voter comes in, and let's use the example of someone who doesn't have their absentee ballot with them. The check-in officer will refer that voter to the chief. The chief knows that's one of the situations that's required on this form. It's one of the situations that this form must be completed for. So they start filling out the information on the front of the form. Then on the back, once the chief or assistant chief has determined that the voter does need to do a provisional ballot, they would hand this form to you as the provisional specialist. And on the bottom half of the backside of the form is the provisional specialist checklist. And what you would do is follow those steps on that checklist. So again, the chief or assistant chief completes the front side of the form, and the provisional specialist completes most of the back side of the form. So let me close with this. Whether it's the same-day registration process or any provisional situation, if you're not sure what to do on election day, by all means, please call the office. We really want to help you make sure that you process every provisional situation correctly. And if you are not 100% sure what to do, call us. If you're looking at a provisional envelope and you're not sure if a voter should or should not have completed a certain field, or if you're not sure if the information that they filled in is the appropriate information for that section, give us a call. If you're not sure if the chief should have asked you to do a provisional ballot for a particular situation, work that out with the chief, and feel free for either of you to call us in that situation. All right, so we've gone over an overview of the provisional process and some updates for this election. Now I want to turn it over to Sean to take you through the actual details of the provisional process and the exact steps that you'll follow. Off to you, Sean.
Thanks, Ravi. After that overview that Ravi just went through, now we're going to dive a little bit deeper and walk through the process for any specific or any particular voter that comes into your precinct. So we'll take it step by step from the time the voter comes in or makes it to your table and what you're doing to help them through that process. So the first thing that's going to happen is that they're going to be determined to be voting provisionally. As Ravi talked about, there is the voter referral worksheet that the chief or assistant chief is using to make their determination for the voter's eligibility or the issuance of that provisional ballot. They're using a lot of resources to come up with that. There's the front side of the front side of the worksheet, which helps them make that decision. They have their chief's notebook and their what ifs, and various resources were available by phone. But don't worry about that. That's for the chief or assistant chief to work through with the voter that we're getting to the point where they're going to be voting provisionally. So those are their sections of the voter referral worksheet. Again, every voter who's going to be voting provisionally is going to be having one of these worksheets. And everything that we have highlighted here is for the chief or assistant chief. On the backside, after they've used the front side to make their determination, the backside is where they record what that determination is. So if we zoom in there, we can see that they mark a checkbox for the reason that the voter is voting provisionally. Sometimes we call these reason codes. These correspond to what's on the provisional envelope itself as well, and determine which side of the provisional envelope that you're filling out with that voter. or you're having that voter fill out. I'm sorry. So there's reason number one, which is the same day registration, the SDR side. And then there's all other provisional reasons, everything you can see listed there, which would be that other side of the envelope. You'll use this to know which side of the envelope to have the voter direct the voter to complete. So once the chief marks on the front side their determination and sets you up with this a recording of which provisional reason they're voting or they're using for that voter, then you'll have them start working through the checklist. So we'll move on now to the last part of this worksheet, which is a checklist that every provisional voter is going to go through with you. So every voter, this one worksheet kind of follows the voter in their journey through the precinct, making it to you as the provisional specialist, and then finally you use it to make sure that everything's been done. So if we zoom in a little bit on that checklist, there's 11 steps you can see. I'm not going to talk about each and every one of them. We'll talk about some of the more important ones or kind of the key steps on this. Essentially, you will sit down with the voter at your provisional specialist table, and they'll complete the envelope that we talked about, all those required sections. And then you'll check the envelope. Again, we'll give you those overlays to check them. Each precinct will have 2 of each kind, so you shouldn't have to compete for or share the overlays too much. You should have plenty to use if you have multiple provisional voters at the table at the same time, because again, you'll have 2 provisional specialists. The voter votes their ballot. That's pretty important, right? That's why they're there. And then they'll insert and seal it into that provisional envelope. And someone else will double check, do sort of a sanity check, that they have completed that provisional envelope after you've reviewed it. And we'll talk about that in just a second. And as Ravi talked about, finally, they'll get recorded on the provisional log on the admin tablet and get given their provisional notice, which we'll talk about in just a second. So every voter has this 11-step checklist. There's a lot of words there, but it's pretty simple what the process they're going through is. This gives you a place to record that you're following the process stepwise for everybody, and also lists out those required fields. It kind of lists them all in one place as opposed to looking at them on the envelope. So we'll give you a quick reminder here. As part of the new provisional envelope design update, which Ravi alluded to a little bit earlier, there's something in the top right that says primary elections party ballot. And as you may already know, this is not a party primary election. This is the November general election. So this provisional envelope is used for any given election that we have throughout the year. But since it's not a party primary, we ask that we're going to have you strike through, just make a single continuous line through that section before giving it to the voter. So that was one of those sections on the checklist, one of those early steps, where you'll write in your precinct number in the top right and then strike through the primary line before giving it to the voter to complete. Because we don't want the voter to think that's a section for them. We don't want them to try to give us any information about how they intend to vote their ballot or get confused in any way. So it's the simplest to just strike through that and give it to the voter in this general election. We'll use that in a primary election, but we'll worry about that next year. After you have done that, again, remember that the voter should complete the appropriate side of the provisional envelope. So we have the SDR side and the side for all other provisional reasons. As I talked about earlier, your voter referral worksheet will tell you which side to use. And again, reason code number 1 is the SDR side, and all other provisional reasons are the other side. And if you see on the bottom left on either of those provisional envelopes, that's where you also make that same marking on the envelope itself for why the voter is voting provisionally. So again, once you have the voter at your table and you have them about to start filling out the provisional envelope, you let them know which side they're filling out. As Ravi talked about earlier, we have those provisional envelope overlays, 1 for each side of the provisional envelope. I should say 2 for each side of the provisional envelope, because we're giving you several just in case. As you can see, as Ravi talked about earlier, I won't belabor the point here. The envelope, when it's filled out, is pretty busy, right? There's a lot of text, not all of it's required. And it's one of the most important things that you as a provisional specialist is doing is making sure the voter has completed everything that's required of them so that they don't have any what we call material omissions on their provisional envelope. So to help you do that, when we drop the overlay on top, it sort of occludes or hides a lot of that noise. It lets you focus on the pieces of it, which are important to review. So it's just a plastic sheet or a plastic sized sheet for the envelope with cutouts over those things that would be omissions, which you'll lay on top to isolate that required information, just to help you focus on those most important fields to make sure they're complete. If you see anything amiss, you'll take the overlay back off and take another look and see if the voter missed information and needs to complete it. Again, it can't do the whole job for you. You'll still have to look at it with your eyes and double check. And we'll go into that a little bit more when we get to the practice problems. But again, this just hides away a lot of the unimportant information, or I guess you could say optional information, and focuses on the what would be material omissions, the important information for the voter to include on the envelope minimally. So after the voter has sat down at your table, you've had them fill out the correct side of the provisional envelope. You're now using this to double check. You'll have someone else perform a double check. That can be your other provisional specialist who should be sitting right next to you, or it could be the chief or assistant chief. In this example, you called over the assistant chief. They took a quick sanity check. Maybe they used the envelope to lay it over and double check, or they just took a quick review. We want to get another set of eyes on the envelope because, again, as we talked about, this is essentially the most important part to make sure that the voter has completed everything required of them while they're there with you at the precinct. Because especially for a voter who's only doing this once, it can be kind of a complicated form to go through. So we want to help them out, and we want to make sure that we've done our part to check that for them. So you'll have another officer double check. You can see that step 6 on the checklist, and it's just a quick checkbox or writing in who helped you perform that double check while you're sitting there with that voter. Then the voter will vote their ballot. Of course, they'll fold it up into fourths. So as you can see in this screenshot, the ballot's going to be bigger than the envelope. We have a very long ballot here in Fairfax County. It's going to be 19 inches long. So that definitely does not fit into an 8.5 by 11 envelope. So it'll have to be folded in half and then in half again by the voter, who will insert it into that envelope and seal it. Importantly, it doesn't go into the DS200. As we talked about earlier, they're not eligible at this time to vote on the DS200. That's why they're voting provisionally, so it can be adjudicated after election day, but before the final results are certified. So it's very important that it goes into that envelope instead of the DS200. You should be sitting away from the DS200s, your provisional specialist table. So this should be a little bit easier. It's hard for the voter to make it all the way across the room without realizing, some voters may get distracted, may not realize that they're supposed to put it into that envelope. They don't have the context for the entire process. So it's, one of your roles is to make sure that they know that they are inserting it into the envelope and that it doesn't make it into the DS200. Finishing up the process here, last couple of steps. They're all pretty straightforward, but we're going through them in detail. Each voter gets a provisional notice. This is a legally required document to give to the voter. It's pretty straightforward. All you have to do is check or mark why the voter voted provisionally today. You don't have to write their name. You don't have to write the date, just why they voted provisionally. And what this document essentially does is it explains to the voter what they just did and what comes next. So it lets the voter know when and where the provisional meeting is going to be held, lets them know where to check for the status or the disposition of their ballot, and it just gives them all of that information in one place, and it's a notice that we're required to give to the voter. So again, it's a very easy check mark for why they voted provisionally. Again, it tells them why they voted provisionally and tells them what comes next. So you'll give that to the voter, and then you'll enter them onto the provisional ballot log. So that's an electronic log on your admin tablet, or it's an app that's appropriately titled Provisional Log. In the top left corner of the admin tablet, which the 2 provisional specialists will have one to share. Every voter who votes provisionally should be entered into that log as part of the process. So it asks you for some basic information, your precinct, the code that's on the provisional envelope. So there's if you recall from earlier, there's a barcode number on each provisional envelope. You'll enter that, and then you'll enter in a lot of the voters' basic info. Think their name, their address, why they voted provisionally, etc. It's important that every voter makes it into that provisional log. But one thing I'll note is that after you've submitted an entry to that log, you can't go back and you can't see what you've submitted all day long or thus far. So as a best practice, we recommend up in the top right of the envelope where you are striking through the party ballot checkboxes and writing your precinct, put a little check mark so that you know as a little visual cue that you have entered that ballot, that provisional envelope into the provisional log. Because otherwise you'd have to call us and we'll tell you we got it. There's just not an easy way for you to confirm after you click that submit and send it on over. That's it. You don't get a list of what you've submitted. So again, a quick little check mark on the provisional ballot envelope itself is the best practice to make sure that you remember that you've done that. And then with that provisional envelope itself, it'll go into the appropriate 1A envelope. These are the envelopes that eventually come back to the government center. And then we start processing all of those applications and all of those SDRs, and we get ready for the next step of the process. You can see there are two on screen, one for SDRs and one for all other provisionals, those non-SDRs, again, for either side of the provisional envelope that the voter has filled out, depending on the reason that they're voting provisionally. It goes into one of those two envelopes, and that helps us out a lot so we can get started with any research or processing right after Election Day, because the clock starts ticking as soon as we get them back. You can see on screen they're stacked. That's because you'll get a lot. You'll get more than one of each, at least two of each, just because we anticipate a lot of provisional ballots this election. We want to make sure that you have enough space to put them all, just in case. So long as it makes into the correct envelope, the SDR or the non-SDR, that's what you do as the last step of the process. So zooming out, we can see that we've walked kind of through that checklist. Every voter should have essentially this as the final status of their process. We've gone through that whole checklist. We've made our marking in the top right. We've completed our section. We didn't talk too much about this, but on the provisional envelope, there's a section for you to sign as well. We've made sure that they have all of their required fields filled out, and the overlay also checks for your section as well, which Ravi talked about earlier. Someone else has double checked. They've put it into the provisional envelope. You've given them their notice. You've entered it into the log, and it's gone into the envelope number 1A. What about this form itself? What about the yellow voter referral worksheet? That should not go with the provisional ballot into the envelope. It should not go into the 1A. On the voter referral worksheet, in the top right, it says return an envelope 8. And that's exactly where these go. These should just be returned loose leaf in envelope 8. And if you don't know where that is, your chief or assistant chief will be holding on to that. So we've walked through the provisional process for any given voter from start to finish, from the time that they are coming away from talking to your chief or assistant chief. They've sat down at your table. We've walked through kind of the 11 steps that you're going through in sequence with them, just to make sure that they make it through that process 100%. We're going to take a moment here or take a couple minutes here to do some practice. So as we've said a couple of times, it's really important that they filled out everything required of them on that provisional ballot. So we're going to open up some Zoom polls like we did earlier to show you an example filled out completed provisional envelope, except it's not completed. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. We're going to ask you to see if there's any material omissions that you can spot on the envelope. So if we go to practice number 1 here, this is just sections 1 through 3 on the SDR side of our provisional envelope. We've cut away sections 4 through the bottom. This is just the top half of that envelope. And you can see next to every required field, there are asterisks. And if we don't have the overlay, that's how we know what's required. You can see it's kind of busy. On screen, you'll see there are a couple of options, A, B, C, and D, for things that are either missing or incomplete. So if you kind of take a second to look at this envelope, look at what the voter has filled out and completed, or what you or the voter has filled out and completed, and see what's missing. We're going to open up a Zoom poll here that should appear on your screen. Go ahead and vote, and it could be more than one answer. There's a multiple choice or multiple answers possible. So you'll take a minute. This is all of these examples we're going to go through are informed by things that voters would do, right? Things that we either see or have seen, or things that could be common or expected. We'll go ahead and drop the overlay on top of this envelope to help you out with that. I see over half of everyone has voted already. So if you haven't voted yet, take a look at this, see if this helps you spot anything. Notably, the overlay does cover up the titles for these fields, because this isn't really a tool to give the voter to write on. It's a checking tool after the fact. So we don't want you to put it on as a template and give it to the voter. Instead, they fill out the envelope and then you put it on to check. So I see that almost everyone's voted here. We'll go ahead and reveal the answers here. Looks like almost everyone got this correct. There were 3 omissions on this envelope. So the voter has missed their they've missed the full social security number. So we'll talk about this in just a second, but the SDR side of the provisional envelope requires the full social security number, whereas the non-SDR side or the other provisional reasons side requires at least the last four. So the voters only put the last four of their social security number, which would be an omission. Again, they have an incomplete address, and it looks like almost everyone got these three right. They've missed their zip code. That's part of the required part of the address, so it is required. And finally, we as the election officer missed writing our precinct number in the top right. So that's not a mistake that the voter made, but it is something that would be, it's on this template, or it's on this overlay to cut out and show you that it's missing. So good job, everyone, for that one. We're going to move on to practice number 2. I think we have 4 of these set up for you. So you'll have plenty of opportunity to practice as we go through here. So again, we're setting up here an example filled out SDR side of the provisional envelope. Same situation. Boxes 1 through 3 are here. And same as before. If you take a look here, we're going to open up the poll. It'll drop on your screen in just a second. Take about, 10, 20 seconds, and then go ahead and answer the poll. Same situation. It could be multiple, not necessarily multiple. I won't give away the answer. And see what the voter or you have missed on this SDR side. So we'll give you a couple seconds to take a look at this without the overlay. Then we'll drop the overlay on and we'll reveal the answer. As more people are answering, I see about half of everyone has answered this one. Now with the overlay on top, if that helps out a bit, you can take a look. Hopefully this helps characterize or provide a way to focus on just those required sections.
This is a bit of a tricky one, Sean. Someone's going to look carefully to see there might be more than one thing here, right?
Well, as I said, there is more than one thing here. Look closely. As we talked about a little bit earlier, the overlay can't do everything for you. It just looks for things that would be missing. So we have about 80 to 90% of people who have answered. I'll give you a second with Ravi's clue there. If you want to take a second and look closer, we'll talk about it when we reveal the answer. All right, so we'll go ahead and close the poll on this one. This is the answer. We are missing or incomplete name. That one's pretty straightforward. They've only written their last name. You can see that one pretty You can see that one pretty easily. The other one that it looks like that was the tricky thing that Ravi was talking about. For the date of birth, they've written the date of the election. That's something that we see happen sometimes. They see a date field and they think it's today's date. That is impossible. The voter was probably not born that day, so they should have written their birth date. So the overlay can't evaluate information for you, right? It's just a tool to use. So you'll lay it on there, see if anything's amiss or missing, and then if it is, take it back off and ask the voter to take another look. And in this circumstance, where the voters made a mistake, you would ask them to spoil this envelope and use a new one. That envelope would go into that provisional envelope would go into envelope 8, and we'd have the voter start over because we don't want to have too many scratch throughs, initials, or anything like that on the envelope. So be on the lookout for things like that. The overlay can only hide away the optional or less important or non-material omission sections, but you still have to, take a look at those sections and see what you see. So we'll go on to practice number 3. Hopefully this one's a bit less tricky. We want to give you guys some realistic examples. On this one, we still omitted sections 4 through 6. Those are always optional, but we have the top of the SDR side of the provisional envelope and the bottom. So that includes the signature blocks as well, which hopefully isn't too much of a hint for what's going on with this envelope. We'll let you have a couple of seconds here as we open this poll to take a look and see what omissions or things that are incomplete that you see on this envelope, and then go ahead and start voting. So we'll give you guys a couple more seconds. This one is a little bit different than the other because we're including the bottom side of the provisional envelope. We can't show the whole thing on screen at once because then it would be too zoomed out. So You just have to imagine sections 4 through 6 missing, but for most voters, they tend to be blank, or at the very least, they're optional. So it looks like we've got about 70% of people who've answered the question so far. We'll drop on the overlay. This helps out get to anybody who's still waiting to vote or waiting to answer. The overlay, we've shown the top half. The bottom half still has cutouts for the signature blocks and your block, your section as the election officer. So it looks like most of you have voted. We'll go ahead and reveal the answer. And this one wasn't as much of a trick as the last one was, or tricky as the last one. We're missing signatures, right? The whole top section is complete. We have complete information. The voter wrote their date of birth. They have every field filled out. They've completed the check boxes that we see there. We'll talk about this in just a second, but I'll mention that the overlays for the check boxes have cutouts over the most common answers to those questions. They wouldn't necessarily be, you don't know the voter's situation. If you see anything missing, that's your cue to, as we said earlier, remove the overlay and take another look and ask the voter to take another look at their envelope. They just cover our most common situations. In this one, though, it's just signatures. The voter mis-signing and the election officer mis-signing and marking their reasons. So they've not filled out that entire block in the bottom left, and the voter's not done section 7 with their signature. So it looks like almost everyone saw that. Good job. We'll move on to our last practice here before we go into some tips and reminders. This is the other side of the provisional envelope for other provisional reasons. So we'll leave this on screen for a little bit because this will be a little bit shifting gears. This is the other side of the envelope. There are material omissions for this one as well, and they're very similar to the SDR side, but they're not exactly the same. If you can read what's there in asterisks on the envelope, and again, on every voter referral worksheet, there'll be a list of what those material omissions are. We'll go ahead and open the poll here. And this is sections 1 through 6. We are not including the election officer section. This is for the all of the voter sections. Looks like a lot of you guys were ready to vote on that poll. Answers are coming in here. Again, we'll drop the overlay for this side onto it after everyone's had a couple seconds to vote. If this helps you look closer for the remaining 10 or so % of you who haven't voted yet, take a second look at this, see if this makes it a little bit easier.
Sean, I know I'm getting older. When I had to double take on the last one with the 1990 birth year to double check, is that person 18 years old or not? Much less 2002.
Much less 2006 even. That would be an 18-year-old here. Yes. Thanks, Robbie. Yeah. So looks like we have about, most people have voted on this one. We'll go ahead and reveal the answers for this one. We have a missing, and this one was a little bit tricky. We didn't want to call attention to it. Same thing where you have to be careful about what you're looking at on the envelope. Seems like most people caught this. The address is incomplete, right? They've just written the street name, not the street number. So, your address would have your street number and your street name and your city and your zip code. So this voter has omitted that. They've left that blank. That would be something to correct or have the voter correct. So you still have to kind of look closely, even though you still see these information under the cutouts. And looks like almost everyone got that. So good job with that. The other one was easier, missing signature, right? Very clearly missing, no signature down there. And then one thing I will call out, seems like a couple of people answered that there was a missing social security number on the non-SDR side or the other provisional reason side. The only required part of the social security number is the last 4. That's why the overlay that has that's for this side of the envelope only has the cutout section over that last 4. Now, if the voter puts their full social security number, that's fine. That's just more information. But there's the part of it that would be a material omission is if they don't provide at least the last 4. And that's a minor difference between the SDR side and the other side. And again, that's covered by what the overlay is actually focusing on. So I hope you guys got something out of that, can help you, look closely at these provisional envelopes in your quiz later on. There'll be a couple, or in the when you get credit for watching this briefing, we'll have a couple more of those. Hopefully this will help you out with those a bit. And I think Gretchen now has some reminders and best practices for everyone. So after having walked through all that, I'm going to turn it over to Gretchen here. Gretchen?
Thanks, Sean. So to wrap up, we have a couple reminders and best practices, just kind of logistical things to keep in mind while you're in the precinct on election day. So to get started, as a reminder that there are 2 admin tablets in your precinct. The chief and the assistant chief will have one, and the 2 provisional specialists will share the other one. But if the chief and assistant chief are busy when they're processing non-routine voters, they may ask you to use your admin tablet to help them out. Primarily, that would be through the My Neighborhood app, which is a tool that you can see in the upper right-hand corner of the admin tablet that allows you to look up a voter's precinct and congressional district. The chief and the assistant chief use this when they're evaluating whether a voter has moved into the precinct and is eligible for a same-day registration. So they will do all the decision-making on the voter referral worksheet, but they may ask you to just look up a quick address and let them know what the precinct and the congressional district are. So this is a really straightforward process. You just go up to that upper bar on the top and type in the voter's address. And then in the left-hand panel, it will show you the precinct and the congressional district. You can see the precinct at the top, and then the congressional district is that first option under the voting districts on the left-hand side. And don't worry if you won't remember all of this now. We have a guide for you on election day. You'll have a sheet of paper that walks you through this as well. So this is not something that's the core part of your duties, but the chief and assistant chief may call on you to help with this if things get really busy in your precinct. Next, I want to really emphasize the most common mistake that provisional specialists make when they're helping provisional voters, and to make sure that you're aware of that and you can make sure that that does not happen in your precinct, is this question number 3 on the SDR side of the envelope. So every voter has to answer this question, and we want to make sure that voters read it carefully and choose the appropriate selection. And so something to keep in mind is that when people are completing a form, sometimes they don't read everything as carefully as they should, and sometimes they just default to checking yes for everything. So we want to make sure that voters actually read this and check the appropriate option. And so every voter must answer that first question, the first yes or no checkbox. And then if a voter has selected yes to that answer, they must also answer that second question. And so the SDR overlay will help you identify to make sure this has been completed correctly. But it's also important that you explain the process to the voter and do that check for yourself as well. Next, just a few tips to include for a presidential election in particular. As Sean had mentioned, that there are going to be multiple of the number 1A envelopes for each of the, in each precinct, both for the non-SDR provisionals and for the SDR provisionals. But start with just one, fit as many as you can into the first envelope, number 1A, and then if it gets full, then you're welcome to use the second. You only have to seal the envelopes that you end up using. Another question that has been very common from our provisional specialists is, what do you do if multiple provisional voters show up at once? Do you deal with 5 of them at a time, or do you treat them one at a time? And the answer is the latter. Only assist one voter at a time. It could be tempting to try to get started with one and shift over to the other, but that's how mistakes happen. And so it's okay if a little bit of a line forms as people are waiting. The most important thing is that every voter accurately completes their envelope and that their ballot gets sealed back in their provisional envelope. So only assist one voter at a time. And that's why we have 2 provisional specialists in the precinct, is so you can process twice as many provisional voters when things get busy. So that leads on to my third point, is that you have a buddy with you in the precinct to help out. And so a couple things to keep in mind with having 2 of you is that you will have still just the one admin tablet between you, because the chief and the assistant chief will have the other admin tablet. So just figure out a system that works well to share it when and pass it back and forth when you're entering the data into the electronic provisional ballot log. The benefit to having 2 of you is that you have a built-in person to do that double check. So again, on the voter referral worksheet, there's a question on there in the checklist that asks who performed that double check. It can be any officer in the precinct, but it's really easy when you have another provisional specialist right there with you who knows the process. So they're an easy person to do that double check if they're not otherwise occupied. And finally, another question that's come up pretty frequently is, what do you do if you're not actively helping a provisional voter? And so I will leave that up to the discretion of the chief and the assistant chief in your precinct of how best to manage the precinct. But if things are not super busy in terms of provisionals, but there's a lot of check-ins going on and other ways that you can help out, you can get shifted over and rotating into some of the other responsibilities. The only thing to keep in mind is that you have to be available whenever a provisional voter comes by. So just make sure that maybe since there's 2 of you in the precinct, have 1 of you available on standby to help a provisional voter, and the other could go rotate into the other positions until things get very busy. And again, that depends on the precinct. Some precincts will be kind of full on provisionals all day, and some may only just get a handful. It depends on just how many non-routine voters end up voting in your precinct on election day. And just a few final reminders in general. We've said this multiple times throughout this briefing, but it bears repeating. Provisional voters are never checked in on the poll pad, and they never cast their ballot on the DS200. The point of the provisional process is that the provisional ballot is set aside and adjudicated later, so it's really important that neither of those things happen and the provisional process is followed correctly. The next thing to keep in mind is to never tell a provisional voter whether their ballot will ultimately be counted. That is not your decision. That is not Office of Election staff decision. That decision lies solely with the Electoral Board. So we don't want to assume how the board is going to adjudicate the ballot. The purpose of the provisional notice is that to allow the voter to go follow up and see ultimately what happened to their ballot, and so you can provide them that information and tell them to check in and follow the instructions on that notice. And my final piece of guidance here is that we have plenty of handouts and extra resources to make sure that if you've forgotten anything, all of your questions will still be answered on election day. So we have printouts that we're going to provide the precinct for provisional specialists with detailed instructions to follow during opening. So how to set up your provisional table that's next to the chief's table. A guide for during the day, so that'll give you a reminder about the voter referral worksheet and My Neighborhood and some final reminders there. And then for closing, so what to do with the number 1A envelopes and how to pack up your precinct as it pertains to provisional specialists. And again, if you have any questions at any point, our office is here to help. We have staff waiting on standby to answer your calls on election day, and we are happy to help out. No question is too small. We're really here to give you guidance. And so in terms of next steps, shortly for all the provisional specialists watching here, we are going to email you a link to take your attendance quiz so you can get credit for watching this briefing. It's about 5 questions. And just to make sure you pass, and you have to answer every question in order to get credit, but you can retake it multiple times if you need to. And if you're looking for additional practice after watching this briefing, if you saw the practice problems, but would actually like to get some hands-on practice with the envelopes themselves, we have in-person workshops coming up, so I definitely encourage you to attend those. They're a great resource. For any chiefs and assistant chiefs who are watching, your required briefing is coming up not today, but next week. Next Tuesday is the chief's briefing. And so you are required to watch that, and you will also have an attendance quiz to complete as well. But if you would like some practice on provisional specifically, you are also welcome to attend the provisional workshop. Those are actually coming up tomorrow and Thursday, so it's very timely. You can sign up for those in the election officer portal. And we have 3 different time slots in each of the days. So this week alone, we have 6 provisional workshops. So there's plenty of practice opportunities to make sure that you feel comfortable and prepared on election day. Great. And so with that, I'm going to open the floor. We have, I know that many of you have been submitting a number of questions. So we will go ahead and start answering those.
And Gretchen, I'm happy that we have our Deputy Director of Elections, Cheryl Jones, with us today, as well as our Voter Services and Same-Day Registration Manager, Bushra Ardalan. And they are the folks that help oversee the process of researching and processing these provisional envelopes. And so we're very happy to have the subject matter experts with us to help answer some of your questions today.
Bushra, I'm going to address the first question to you. Why might a same-day registration be rejected, and how is the voter notified if their application is rejected?
So there is a different reason for SDR application to be denied. The most important if it was completed incorrectly. So for any missing information, the registration SDR will be denied. Also, if we have felony convicted and other prohibited voters that they should not be registered, the application will be denied. After election, we will send a notification that their SDR was denied and their provisional was not counted.
And a second question for you, Bushra. How do we handle someone who is not on the poll book, possibly because they've been removed from the voter rolls?
So if someone show up and they were all not on the poll book, if they are eligible voter and they are residents of Fairfax County, they have right to submit SDR as other voter in Fairfax County. The important, they need to be eligible and they need to be a resident of Fairfax County.
And Bushra, I just want to confirm, to do a same-day registration in a given precinct, does that individual need to live in that precinct to do a same-day registration there?
Definitely. On election day, yes, they must reside at the precinct when they are applying for SDR.
So Cheryl, we've got a couple of questions for you. One is, what is the process after a provisional vote has been cast in the precinct? When is the office opened? What does the voter need to do? Is there a deadline for them to provide information?
Hi, everyone. First of all, thanks so much, all you guys who have volunteered to be provisional specialists. It's a really, really important role. And I know it seems complicated. Ravi and Sean and team have worked hard to try to make it easy for you because we want every ballot from a qualified voter to count. And so we're trying to reduce the risk of errors that you might make to ensure that ballot is going to be counted if it's qualified. So now that I've done that talking, I can't remember your question.
So basically, the question is, what happens after the vote is
yes. Oh,
done
okay.
in the precincts?
Right. So the envelopes come back here and we sort them that night, and then the next day the SDRs come to the voter registration team because they're used to dealing with voter registration applications, and all the others go to our other provisional team. And we have, I think each of us have about 50 people signed up to be working on these because we expect so many. And the staff work in teams of 2 to review that envelope and then look in Veris and find out, is this person already registered? Have they already submitted an absentee ballot? Why were they marked in the poll book as already voted? So we do this research to try to figure it out. And then after a team has reviewed the envelope, it gets a second review and a check. And this is why it's so important for you to have the information entered correctly in the admin tablet, because we go by that information and be sure the reason is checked correctly. If you say it's not on poll book, but actually the person was on the poll book and the problem is they were an absentee voter, that's important. And so be sure you mark the right reason, be sure all the data is in there correctly. So we fill in the extra data needed from Vera, such as the voter ID number. And then when they're all done, we recommend a yes or a no. In other words, if it's an absentee voter and we haven't received an absentee ballot, we'll recommend yes. And then all these recommendations and go to the electoral board. This year it'll be on Wednesday, the week following the election. And then the electoral board votes whether to approve or not approve. And some of them are pretty straightforward. For example, we didn't receive an absentee ballot back. That's pretty straightforward. But there are some that are more complicated. The voter is marked as already voted, or well, we get all kinds of interesting things. Or maybe they transpose figures in their social security number. Maybe they didn't put the social security number down. And so we explain the situation to the board and they're the ones who decide whether to accept it. And then when the ones that are accepted, we have a great big envelope opening party, and the envelopes are opened by an envelope opening machine, and we have a big team of people, and they extract the envelopes. We put the ballots through the high-speed scanner, and they all get counted, and the provisionals are their own precinct. And so their votes are recorded as the provisional precinct. So those votes don't get added into your precinct votes on that night. And then they get reported. You can see them on the state website and on our website.
So following up with that, the voter, how does the voter know if their vote got counted? Is there a place for them to call or check on that?
Yeah, they need to wait that week because nothing's going to happen. You know, we're not going to get the information. Nothing's going to happen until probably that Thursday following the election, a week following the election. They can look in the citizen portal where they can find out the status of their ballot, and they can also give us a call. Everyone whose ballot was rejected will get a letter telling them why their ballot was rejected. You know, for example, they didn't sign the provisional envelope or they were in the wrong precinct. But the people whose ballot was accepted won't get a letter. It'll just be recorded. But they're welcome to call us, but they should be sure to wait because it's not an instantaneous process.
Okay, thanks. And then a quick question also, do they need to show when they do an ID at the precinct with the specialist, it's the same IDs as they would use for regular check-in, is that right?
Right, because the ID they're showing is to vote. It's not to complete a provisional ballot or to register. The ID is because they are voting. So it's the same IDs as you would check normally.
Gretchen, I've got a couple of questions for you. First is, are provisional voters checked in on the poll pads or only put in on the admin provisional log?
That is a great question, and the answer is no, provisional voters are never checked in on the poll pad. So only the voters who cast their ballot on the DS200 scanner are the ones checked in on the poll pad, which means that everything is taken care of in the provisional envelope and the provisional ballot log. So that is the place that you'll record the voter information. Again, not on the poll pad or in the DS200, just in the provisional ballot log.
And a second question, is a provisional specialist basically the same as the extra assistant chief?
Another good question, and the answer to that one is no as well. So the assistant chief has a number of responsibilities and does the same training that a chief does. So they go through the same training requirements. They're going to watch the chief's briefing. So they have more responsibilities for the overall precinct management. So they handle all kinds of non-routine voter situations. They help delegate tasks and responsibilities and do a number of things that the provisional specialist is not trained to do. So the provisional specialist's role is really focused zeroing in on the provisional process. So you're an expert in that, but not in everything else going on in the precinct. Although it is a good stepping stone, so you have a little bit more responsibility in the precinct. So we may be following up with you after this election to see if you'd be interested in serving as a chief or an assistant chief. But again, that would be for a later election.
Okay, let me ask you one more question, actually. Will both provisional specialists be on duty at all times, or will one or the other serve at other stations, such as DS200 or poll pads?
We'll leave that one up to the discretion of the chief and the assistant chief in your precinct, depending on how busy things are and how many provisionals you're getting. Again, like I said earlier, we want to make sure that there is one provisional specialist ready to help out provisional voters at all times, but there's still plenty of time for you all to take breaks and to rotate into the other stations, assuming that things aren't as busy on the provisional side of things.
And Gretchen, if I could just add to that, where every precinct is getting the 2 provisional specialists, and in the very small precincts, if you only have 1,000 registered voters or 200 registered voters, like our smallest precincts, you may not have many provisionals throughout the day. But in our larger precincts, 3, 4, 5, up to 6,000 registered voters, we expect a constant flow of provisional voters. In those cases, I think we would expect to see the provisional specialists staying at the provisional table throughout the day. Is that right?
Yes, and yeah, the busiest precincts will definitely have, you'll be constantly busy, so you'll expect if you're in one of those busier precincts to just stay focused on provisionals the whole time.
So Ravi, we're going to you. Can you address a situation if a provisional voter insists on scanning their ballot on the DS200? How do we prevent that from happening?
Sure, that's a great question. I saw a couple of people ask that. What do you do if a voter insists on scanning their ballot in the DS200? Well, let's just start with this. That would be breaking the law. A provisional voter, as we've said before, is never allowed to scan their ballot in the DS200. And the reason for that is the whole point of a provisional ballot is because we have not yet 100% confirmed the voter's eligibility to cast a ballot in that election. So a provisional voter should never be permitted to scan a ballot in the scanner. And that's why it's your job as the provisional specialist to keep the provisional voters with you at the provisional table, far away from the scanner, and stay with them as they are marking their ballot. Because a voter may not realize they're marking their ballot and they just want to walk over like everyone else to scan it. But if they're a provisional voter, they are never allowed to do that. That's one of the reasons why in this large election, we're issuing 2 provisional specialists to every precinct, so that between the two of you, you can make sure you stay with every provisional voter. Let them know that right when they start filling out their envelope and their ballot as well, that once they finish their ballot, it will be sealed in an envelope, not scanned on the machine. And if a voter still has any issues with that, tell them to call our office.
Okay, great. And then another question about interacting with authorized representatives. How will that work?
Sure. So authorized representatives, commonly known as poll watchers, are a welcome and legal part of the election process. Just like the voters and the election officers, you may have authorized representatives at a polling place. Authorized representatives, they may represent a party on the ballot or an independent candidate on the ballot. They are there to observe the process, not to participate in the process. They may choose to sit near you as you're helping a provisional voter, and they can listen into what that conversation is. But if they have any issues with that, then they need to either call their party or candidate, or they need to call us in the Office of Elections, or they can go and speak with the chief election officer. So again, they're there to observe, not to be a part of the process. Cheryl, is there anything else you would add to that in terms of the role of the authorized representatives, specifically in the provisional process?
Yeah, I think that's it. They can't get involved. They can't see the voters form that they're filling out. They can't see the ballot. They can't handle anything. You know, they can ask the reason. I think, you know, you can say an absentee ballot, but they're not part of the process. That's the important thing.
And again, if you as the provisional specialist have any issues with not just an authorized rep, but anyone, call over the chief. That's what they're prepared to help with. Thank you, Cheryl.
Okay.
Susan, Steve, Jean, do we have more questions?
Yes, we certainly do. Sean is the next person in the hot seat. And just a couple of softballs, then we're going to get to a real juicy one. First of all, does the provisional specialist recheck the voter's ID, or do we assume that the chief or assistant chief has already done that?
Sure, that's a good question, one we didn't really talk too much about, but if you were paying attention, the first step on the provisional checklist on the back of the voter referral worksheet is to confirm that the voter has shown an acceptable ID. And this is also a checkbox on the bottom left corner of the provisional side of, the SDR side of the provisional envelope. So hopefully that voter will just have it out with them and they can present it to you, and you can confirm that because you're the one signing that the voter has presented acceptable ID, that you've seen the acceptable ID, right? Because it's going to be your signature down in that block. So hopefully they'll use the exact same one that they had ready at the precinct, but yes, so that's the first step of the process there.
Great, thank you. Since only the chief or assistant chief is deciding whether the voter is eligible to cast a provisional ballot or do a same-day registration, why would the I cannot talk today. Provisional specialist use the My Neighborhood app?
Sure, that's a good question. For those of you who've served as an SDR specialist in the past, you might recall that we have only had one admin tablet in the precinct. So there was it sort of had to be shared or looked up, or you had to go back and forth to look up the address on the My Neighborhood app. Now that we have two admin tablets, it's going to be hopefully a lot easier to make that transition. But the easy answer to your question, or the straightforward answer to your question, is just in case. If the chief or assistant chief is busy, they're using their admin tablet for something else, or you have capacity, it's important for you to be able to do that if requested. Again, because we have two provisional specialists and two admin tablets to selection, hopefully the chief or assistant chief will be able to take care of the whole thing from start to finish for the voter, but so that you're available to help out as needed, depending on what their capacity looks like throughout the day. So it's important to know how the app works, or that it exists in the first place in case you need to help out with it as a backup.
Thanks, Sean. We got a lot of questions from people about how to handle mistakes on the provisional envelope on either side of the envelope. Some people said that in training they were advised there can be no mistakes in sections 1 and 3, not even crossouts. So can you review for us what kind of mistakes can be crossed out, if any? And if you make a mistake, how do you spoil the envelope? What do you do with it? Just some more guidance on that would be appreciated.
Sure. So I want to be pretty particular here, because if there's a lot of ways that a voter can make a mistake. Maybe they've made the whole address, they've written the whole wrong address. They misremembered their old address and they said, wait a second, I got to write this whole thing down again. Or maybe they just wrote a 2 instead of a 3, right? Those corrections would look kind of different. The easy thing to say is that if there's any sort of issue or error, to just spoil the envelope. Certain things really can't be corrected and initialed and changed easily, especially answers to checkboxes or wholesale changes, like say they have to cross through and write their entire new social security number because they wrote, I don't know, their phone number. You'd want to spoil that whole envelope so that it's clear and unambiguous, that you have complete information on that envelope. So to do that, you would just write spoiled all across the envelope and put it into envelope 8 and proceed with a new provisional envelope. If the voter, wrote a 1, but they want to write over it a 2, that's a little bit of a different story, a little bit of a different circumstance. I hope that's clear to kind of emphasize that if it's a significant correction, you would just want to have it be spoiled and do a new envelope. Does that make sense?
It does. I'd like to tease out just a little bit more. Let's say somebody's got bad handwriting. Can the provisional specialist print above it, to make it clear what the writing actually says, or is that not okay? And kind of going along with that, what do you do if the voter needs assistance filling out the provisional envelope? Do they need to complete a request for assistance form?
So that's a great question. That's a great topic, because that does come up in something that we've talked about before in some of our provisional specialist workshops a little bit. So you don't want to make alterations to their envelope by writing for them, but you can be their assistant to fill out the envelope, if that makes sense. So if the voter has illegible handwriting, you can assist them in completing the envelope. So long as you're not the one signing it, the voter should still sign or make the mark on that envelope. If you need to help them with the ballot itself, you would want to fill out the request for assistance form, but not necessarily just for the envelope. If you look at the request for assistance form, which I don't have here in front of me, but that form is specifically for the ballot, the envelope, so long as it is their information, you can assist them with that, especially if it's going to be illegible. Because if it's illegible for you in the precinct, it's going to be illegible for us here at the office as well. So
Sean, would
if
you
need to
say the safest option is just, if you're helping the voter complete the ballot or the envelope, just to go ahead and do the request for assistance? There's no harm in doing that.
Yeah, no, I mean, without getting too into the weeds on it, it would be the most straightforward to just do a request for assistance form, especially because you can't tell before the fact if the voter is going to need help with the, before they see the ballot, that they're going to have trouble marking those very small target ovals. So safest thing to do is, if the voter, say, has issues writing, go ahead and fill out the request for assistance form. Then you're good with them through that entire interaction without overcomplicating it.
That's super helpful, gentlemen. Thank you. And finally, for Sean, I'm going to do one quick one for you, and then we'll turn it over to Ravi. Sean, what do we do if the voter does not wish to answer the gender question?
Sure, that's a good question. Something that I saw a couple of times show up through our Q&A feature. So without getting too into the weeds again on the issue of on the topic of the gender question, that is on the SDR side of the envelope with an asterisk, and so it would be one of the fields that the voter is asked to fill out. But we aren't qualifying that further, so the voter can answer anything in that box, and that is something that they can put anything, and we're not determining what their answer is. or what they're writing down there. The voter can answer that in any way they want, and that can also, I believe, be one of the only, and I don't want to get too confusing about this, but that is one that can be left blank, I believe. I think I'll ask Bushra, is that true?
Yes, I answered the questionnaire when I write it down the answer. So gender is required, but it's not omission. So if somebody did not provide gender, we will not deny that SDR. And whatever they put, F, M, and non-binary, so we will take those application and process them. And even they left it blank, as I said, is not omission, we will not deny it.
But that's the, and again, without getting too complicated, that's the only one. Of course, if they leave their signature or their social or their address blank, that's an
Yes,
entirely different story.
we are talking about the gender. Gender is required, but it's not omission. Okay.
Bushra, what about if the voter does not have a middle name, but they do not check the none box in that middle name field to indicate that they don't have a middle name? It's kind of the same thing. It's an omission.
No, actually, for middle name is different. For that reason, we always ask for you to review the application on SDR. If the person did not provide the middle name, please ask them, do you have a middle name? If they said, yes, we do have middle name, so ask them to write down the middle name. If the person said, no, we do not, I do not have middle name, the none box should be checked, because that will be, if they did not check it and they did not write down their middle name, is more work for us, because by law we're required to contact the voter, and there will be we don't have time during the SDR. So middle name, full name is required unless the voter do not have middle name. So none box should be checked. So please review the application for missing information. Okay.
Thank you, Bushra. That's why we're using
Sure.
the overlays.
And that's why we're very happy to have the experts like Butcher here with us.
Yes.
Thank you.
Very much
Thank
so.
you.
Ravi, we've got 3 last questions for you. If a voter is in the wrong precinct, can they choose to vote a provisional ballot instead of going to the correct precinct?
Yeah, this is a very common situation, especially towards the end of the voting day at 6:30 p.m. If a voter arrives in your precinct at any time during the day, and the chief or you look them up in My Neighborhood and you see that that voter does not live in your precinct, you need to do everything possible to get that voter to go to the correct precinct. Virginia law requires a voter to vote, even if it's provisionally, in the precinct in which they are either registered or which they currently reside, depending on how long ago they may have moved. But in general, they need to go to the right precinct, and you should do everything possible to get them to go to the right precinct. Ultimately, the electoral board will review provisional ballots wherever they are cast, and they will, take into consideration Virginia law, which requires a voter to vote in the precinct in which they reside.
Now, Ravi, can I ask? Would you characterize it as fair to say that the chief or assistant chief would be the one having that conversation with the voter, because they would be checking the voter's address, they'd be checking what precinct they're in before they make it to the provisional specialist table?
Absolutely. So the chief or assistant chief would be the individual having that conversation with the voter. And that's a great clarification, because many of you today here with us are provisional specialists. The only other time that I can think of that it would come up would be if the chief or assistant chief asks you to look up in My Neighborhood where the voter lives, and you notice that the voter does not live in your precinct, then you can provide that information to the chief and they can follow up with the voter. Thank you, Sean.
Appreciate that. Ravi, what do we do with a voter who is not able to recall their social security number that is required for the same-day registration?
Sure. So keep in mind, it is the voter's responsibility to complete the provisional envelope accurately and completely. So in this case, if the voter doesn't remember their own social security number, it's their responsibility to fill in that information. And you would point out to them, hey, you haven't filled in your social security number. And then however the voter wants to get that information, maybe they can call a family member who knows that information. Maybe they want to go home and come back later in the day after they've checked on that information. But ultimately, it's the voter's responsibility, and a provisional envelope can't be considered unless all required information is entered.
Thank you. And our final question is, can you use the ID confirmation statement instead of verifying the voter's ID?
Sure. So as I think Cheryl mentioned earlier, the acceptable ID list that is provided every precinct applies both for a normal voter just routinely checking in, or for provisional voters as well, right? So whichever situation it might be, the same list of acceptable IDs applies. And one form of acceptable ID is for the voter to complete an ID confirmation statement. You may have personal thoughts about that one or the other, but that is Virginia law. Virginia law allows a voter to complete an ID confirmation statement. And in Fairfax County, we follow the law. So yes, that is an acceptable form of ID. And just keep in mind, if a voter doesn't have an ID with them, the most common situation would be that voter completing an ID confirmation statement, which is something the chief would likely help them with. It shouldn't end up resulting in a no ID provisional ballot, which is something that used to be much more common before 2020 when the ID confirmation statement was introduced by law. Jean, I believe you said that was the last of our questions. Is that correct?
It is. Would like to add that on election day, there are several copies of the acceptable ID chart available in the precinct, and I'm sure that the provisional specialists will have access to that. And yes, that is the end of our questions.
Great. I know we've gone a little bit longer than we thought we would today, but we really appreciate you guys submitted lots of great questions, and we're very happy to be able to answer them. We answered a lot of them in writing during the chat. We've answered them here live at the end of the Q&A, and we'll send out some information between now and Election Day summarizing all these questions and the answers, so you have it between now and then as well. I want to close on this note. I can't tell you enough how much we appreciate all of you serving as provisional specialists or in other capacities in this election. A presidential election is exciting, but it can also be very stressful. And I can tell you this, if I was an election officer out in the field still, I'm not sure I would agree to be a provisional specialist, because there's just more to do, right? And you have the power to help ensure that every provisional voter's vote can be considered and potentially counted. That's a great responsibility, and we're trusting you with that. And so for our part, we just want to say thank you in advance. And we hope you do everything you can to help ensure that the process is followed from start to finish completely and accurately, so that every provisional voter's ballot can at least be considered. Our goal is to have zero errors and omissions in this election. And we're doing a number of different things to help drive that down, from having 2 provisional specialists, from having you all complete the required provisional training and now this provisional briefing, to offering the provisional overlays, and just having lots of different resources available to you before and on election day. But as always, if you have any questions or need any help before or on election day, the office is just a phone call away. We have folks here on election day before, like Cheryl and Bushra, who are the subject matter experts, who would love to be able to help you handle this correctly. And we have a lot of other people helping staff our different call centers to make sure that we can provide the support that you need. So on that, I will just say again, thank you so much for serving. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you have a great and smooth election day. And don't forget to take the required quiz that has already been sent to you by email. Thanks a lot, and have a great election.